Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood backstage at the Piers Morgan live studio, her Navy Powers suit perfectly pressed, her expression calm but determined. The bright lights of the London studio bounced off her gold earrings as she listened to Piers Morgan's opening monologue through her earpiece. Tonight we have Democrat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett joining us to defend her party's disastrous policies, Morgan announced with his trademark smirk. I wonder if she'll actually answer a straightforward question for once. Crockett smiled to herself. Piers Morgan, the self-proclaimed voice of reason with his British accent and reputation for making guests squirm, thought she would be an easy target. What he didn't know was that Jasmine Crockett, a former defense attorney and fiery Texas representative, had come prepared with receipts that would leave him speechless. As she walked onto the stage, the audience politely applauded. Morgan didn't stand to greet her, just gestured to the chair across from him. Congresswoman, good of you to join us, he said, his tone already confrontational. What happened in the next 10 minutes would send shock waves across social media and leave Piers Morgan, for perhaps the first time in his broadcasting career, completely stunned into silence. Before we dive into this explosive interview, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you never miss our latest political showdowns and exclusive analysis. Piers Morgan had built his career on being the tough-talking interviewer who never backed down. With his show now broadcasting to both British and American audiences, he positioned himself as a centrist who tells it like it is, while increasingly leaning into right-wing talking points. His aggressive interview style had made politicians from both sides uncomfortable, but he particularly enjoyed challenging progressive Democrats, whom he often accused of being woke and out of touch. What viewers at home didn't see was Morgan's pre-show routine. Just 30 minutes earlier, he had been reviewing a thin folder of talking points about Crockett, prepared by a junior producer. This should be easy, he had told his makeup artist while getting final touch-ups. These progressive politicians always crumble when faced with real questions. The makeup artist had nodded politely, having heard similar comments before. Previous interviews, Morgan had then done what he always did before confrontational segments. Practiced his most skeptical facial expressions in the mirror, perfecting the raised eyebrow and disapproving frown that had become his trademark. Tonight's going to make for great clips, he had said to no one in particular, as he headed to the set. At 58, Morgan sat with the confidence of a man who believed he controlled the narrative in every room he entered. His show's ratings had been slipping lately, and producers had been pushing for more viral moments. Taking down a rising Democratic star would certainly deliver that. Across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, the 42-year-old congresswoman from Texas who had risen quickly through political ranks. A former criminal defense attorney with over 15 years of legal experience before entering politics, Crockett had built a reputation for her precise, non-nonsense approach, and unwillingness to tolerate disrespect from political opponents. What Morgan and his producers had apparently failed to research was Crockett's background in high-pressure courtrooms, where she had faced down hostile judges and aggressive prosecutors. Unlike many politicians who wilted under Morgan's pressure tactics, Crockett had spent her career preparing for exactly this type of confrontation. Congresswoman Crockett, Morgan began shuffling papers dramatically. Your party has been claiming economic success, while ordinary Americans struggle with inflation. How do you defend these contradictions? His tone suggested he had already determined her guilt before the trial had even begun. The stakes couldn't be higher for both participants. For Morgan, this was another opportunity to score points against progressive politics and generate viral clips. For Crockett, this was a chance to set the record straight, not just for herself, but for the policies she believed would help everyday Americans. The tension in the studio was palpable as the lights shined down on both combatants. Well, Piers, I appreciate the question, Crockett began calmly, sitting straight and making direct eye contact. But before I address it, I'd like to correct your introduction. You said our policies have been disastrous, but the economic data tells a different story. Morgan immediately cut in. The data I'm looking at shows inflation hurting working families. But Crockett held up her hand slightly, continuing without raising her voice. If you've invited me here for a conversation, I'd appreciate the courtesy of finishing my sentences." The small audience murmured at her directness. Morgan, unused to being interrupted in his interruptions, leaned back slightly. "The fact is," she continued, "under this administration, we've seen record job growth, manufacturing returning to America, and infrastructure investments that will pay dividends for decades. Now, regarding inflation, that's the typical Democrat talking point." Morgan jumped in again, his voice rising. "But real people are struggling to buy groceries, while you're in Washington celebrating so-called victories." Crockett's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. "Piers, do you actually want to hear my answers, or did you invite me here to listen to yourself talk?" A few nervous laughs came from the audience. Morgan's face reddened slightly. "I want real answers, not political spin." "Then let me give you one," Crockett replied. She pulled out a small notebook from her jacket pocket. "I came prepared because I suspected you might be more interested in creating a viral moment than having a substantive discussion." The production team, sensing the tension building, zoomed in on Morgan's face as his expression darkened. This wasn't going according to his usual script. "Let's talk about what real people are experiencing," Crockett continued. "Unemployment is down to historic lows. We've passed legislation capping insulin costs for seniors. The bipartisan infrastructure bill is creating jobs in red and blue states alike." Morgan jumped in, "But inflation is a global phenomenon." Crockett completed his sentence. "The UK's inflation rate has been higher than America's for much of the past 2 years. Would you blame your conservative government for global supply chain issues too, or is economic criticism only for Democrats?" The camera caught Morgan's momentary surprise at her knowledge of UK economic statistics. "That's not a fair comparison," he started. "Actually, it's perfectly fair," Crockett countered, pulling out more notes. "I have the comparative inflation rates right here. Would you like me to share them with your viewers?" Morgan shifted strategy. "Let's move to crime rates in Democrat-run cities. Your party has embraced policies that have led to skyrocketing violence." "That's factually incorrect," Crockett cut in. Her voice still measured, but firmer now. "FBI data shows violent crime declining nationally over the past 2 years. I can cite specific statistics for any city you'd like to discuss." The studio grew increasingly tense as Morgan realized his guest had come armed with facts for every talking point he planned to raise. The production team, sensing a shift in momentum, cut to a commercial break. As the cameras temporarily stopped rolling, Morgan leaned over to his producer, visibly frustrated. Viewers at home didn't hear what was said, but Crockett's microphone caught her saying calmly, "I have plenty more corrections if needed." When they returned from the break, Morgan's strategy had changed. He was now going for personal attacks. "Congresswoman, you've been criticized for your confrontational style in Congress. Some have called it unprofessional. Don't you think this undermines your effectiveness?" The question was designed to put her on the defensive, but Crockett smiled slightly. "I find it interesting that when women of color speak directly and truthfully, it's labeled confrontational. But when men do the same thing, like you're doing right now, it's called hard-hitting journalism." The audience reacted with a mix of oohs and nervous laughter. Morgan's expression tightened. "This isn't about gender or race," he began. "Isn't it?" Crockett asked. "Let me ask you something, Piers. How many times have you described male politicians who stand their ground as hysterical or emotional? As I've watched your interviews carefully in preparation for tonight." The camera caught Morgan glancing at his notes, clearly thrown off balance. His planned attack points were being systematically dismantled before he could fully deploy them. "The reality is," Crockett continued, "I was elected to represent my constituents forcefully. When legislation affects their health care, their voting rights, their economic opportunities, yes, I speak up. That's not confrontation. That's representation." Morgan, searching for a new angle, brought up a controversial vote. "You recently voted against a bill that had bipartisan support. How do you explain that to your constituents who might have benefited?" Crockett's eyes narrowed slightly. "Which bill specifically are you referring to, Piers? There have been several bipartisan bills recently, with very different implications." The camera caught Morgan glancing down at his notes again, clearly searching for details he didn't have at his fingertips. The infrastructure additions from last month, he said vaguely. There was no such bill last month, Crockett replied calmly. Are you perhaps referring to H.R. 2917, which wasn't about infrastructure but contained hidden provisions to weaken environmental protections? I'd be happy to explain my vote if that's the one you mean. The audience could sense Morgan's growing frustration as Crockett continued to counter each point with specific facts and figures. His usual tactic of speaking over guests was failing, as she remained unflappable, responding to each interruption with increased precision rather than matching his emotional escalation. Let's move on, Morgan said abruptly, abandoning the line of questioning. Your party's approach to the border crisis. I'm glad you brought that up, Crockett interjected, pulling out another sheet of paper. As a representative from Texas, I actually have first-hand knowledge of the border situation, unlike many who simply use it as a talking point. The tension continued to build as Crockett systematically addressed each topic Morgan raised, with specific data, personal experiences from her constituents, and occasionally turning questions back on Morgan himself. With each exchange, Morgan's famous composure began to crack further. 40 minutes into what was supposed to be a 30-minute interview, the confrontation reached its climax. Morgan, visibly frustrated by his inability to corner Crockett, decided to go for what he thought would be a knockout punch. Congresswoman, I've been patient with your long-winded responses, Morgan said, his tone now openly hostile. But let's be honest with viewers. Just last week, you made claims about economic improvements in your district that simply aren't supported by the data. In fact, I have a report right here. He held up a folder showing unemployment in parts of her district remains above the national average. For the first time, Crockett actually smiled widely. The camera caught her expression as she reached into her bag and pulled out a thick binder. Piers, she said, her voice calm but with an edge of triumph. I'm familiar with the report you're referencing. It was published by the Center for Economic Opportunity, correct? Morgan nodded, looking slightly thrown by her recognition of the report. What you may not be aware of, Crockett continued, opening her binder to a marked page, is that this report has been thoroughly debunked, not just by Democrats but by independent economists. She pulled out a document. This is a statement from the Bureau of Labor Statistics contradicting those findings. Would you like me to read it? Morgan shifted uncomfortably. That's your interpretation. It's not an interpretation. It's a correction of factual errors, Crockett replied. But more importantly, Piers, did you know that the Center for Economic Opportunity is funded primarily by industries with direct financial interests in misrepresenting economic data from districts like mine? The camera zoomed in on Morgan's face as it transformed from confidence to confusion. I have here, Crockett continued, pulling out another document, the center's tax filings showing that 78% of their funding comes from 3 corporations that have actively lobbied against legislation I've supported to raise the minimum wage and strengthen worker protections. The studio fell completely silent. Morgan opened his mouth but then closed it again. But the most interesting part, Crockett said, her voice now measured and deliberate, is that one of those corporations is Regent Media Partners, which, according to public records, is a major sponsor of. She paused for effect. This very show. The camera caught Morgan's expression freezing. Behind the scenes, producers could be heard muttering urgently. That's not relevant to the data. It's entirely relevant to this conversation, Crockett replied. You presented information to your viewers as independent analysis, when it comes from a source with clear conflicts of interest, including financial ties to your own show. Don't you think your viewers deserve that context? The audience, initially quiet throughout much of the interview, began murmuring loudly. Someone actually applauded. Morgan, visibly rattled, tried to regain control. We'll need to verify these claims. Please do, Crockett nodded. In fact, I've prepared a document with all the relevant sources for your fact checkers. She slid a folder across the table to him. Transparency matters, doesn't it, Piers? The camera caught Morgan's shocked expression as he realized he had walked into a trap of his own making. His face flushed red, a vein visibly pulsing in his forehead, as he struggled to maintain his composure. "We'll take another break," he said abruptly. "Before we do," Crockett said, still perfectly composed, "I want to make something clear to your viewers. I came here tonight expecting a fair conversation about policy differences. Instead, you've attempted to ambush me with misleading information. That might make for entertaining television, but it doesn't serve the public." Morgan, now openly flustered, tried to interrupt, but Crockett continued. "The issues facing our country, economic inequality, healthcare access, climate change, these are too important for gotcha moments and misleading statistics. Your viewers, both in America and the UK, deserve better." "That's your opinion," Morgan began, but his voice lacked conviction. "No, Piers," Crockett said firmly. "That's not opinion. That's professional integrity. Something I practice as a congresswoman, and something I expected from a journalist with your experience." As they cut to commercial, the cameras caught Morgan ripping off his microphone, his face a mask of frustration and disbelief. The clip of his expression, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, completely lost for words, would soon become the thumbnail image for dozens of viral videos across social media. When they returned from the break, Morgan had visibly tried to compose himself, but the damage was done. His typical confident demeanor had cracked, revealing an interviewer who had been thoroughly outmatched. "We're back with Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett," he said stiffly. "Before the break, you made some interesting claims about our sponsors." "I made factual statements backed by public records," Crockett corrected him gently. "But if you'd prefer, we can move on to discuss policy solutions rather than continue this media analysis." Morgan, clearly eager to move away from the topic of his show's funding, nodded quickly. "Yes, let's do that. Your party has proposed new spending that many economists say could increase inflation. How do you respond?" "Which economists specifically?" Crockett asked immediately. "Because Nobel Prize winners like Joseph Stiglitz and Paul Krugman have argued precisely the opposite." For the remaining 10 minutes of the interview, the dynamic had completely shifted. Morgan asked questions with noticeably less aggression, while Crockett continued to provide detailed, fact-based responses. The audience, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary, sat in rapt attention as a clearly subdued Morgan tried to salvage what remained of the interview. As they wrapped up, Morgan attempted to end on what he hoped would be a unifying note. "Well, Congresswoman, while we clearly have our differences, I think we can agree that robust debate is essential to democracy." Crockett nodded. "Absolutely, Piers. Robust, fact-based debate, where both parties come prepared and treat viewers with enough respect to be honest with them, that's what democracy requires." The subtle emphasis on fact-based and prepared wasn't lost on the audience or on Morgan himself, whose forced smile didn't reach his eyes, as the cameras pulled back and the show's theme music began to play. Within minutes of the interview ending, clips began circulating online. The moment when Crockett revealed the connection between the report Morgan cited and his show's sponsors was shared tens of thousands of times, with captions like, "Crockett exposes Morgan's conflict of interest live on his own show," and, "The moment Piers Morgan realized he messed with the wrong congresswoman." The expression on Morgan's face, shock, followed by barely concealed anger, became an instant meme. Social media users quickly paired the image with captions like, "When you come unprepared to a fight with a former trial attorney and Pav, you thought you could ambush a black woman lawyer with fake statistics." On Twitter, Crockett's shutdown of Morgan started trending within an hour, reaching the number 3 spot nationally by midnight. Progressive politicians and commentators shared the clip widely, with one senator tweeting, "This is how you handle bad faith interviews. Take notes, everyone." Even some conservative commentators acknowledged Morgan's defeat, with one writing, "Regardless of your politics, you have to admit Crockett came prepared, and Morgan didn't. This is why you do your homework, folks." By morning, the full interview had been viewed over 7 million times across various platforms. Media analysts began dissecting what had happened, with one CNN commentator noting, "What we witnessed wasn't just a politician handling a tough interview, it was a complete reversal of the power dynamic that Morgan has relied on for years. The fallout for Morgan's show was swift. Within 48 hours, Regent Media Partners issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging their sponsorship but denying any editorial influence. This only fueled further speculation, with media watchdog groups calling for an investigation into potential conflicts of interest across Morgan's previous interviews. Morgan himself initially tried to downplay the incident, tweeting, "Always enjoy a spirited debate." Congresswoman Crockett certainly came prepared. "We'll have to have her back sometime." But the damage control seemed hollow, as clips continued to circulate showing his visible discomfort and uncharacteristic speechlessness. For Crockett, the aftermath was transformative. Her social media following doubled within days. Interview requests flooded in from major networks and publications. Fellow Democrats began asking her to help prepare them for difficult media appearances. What had been intended as a hostile interview on a show with limited reach had catapulted her into the national spotlight. The most significant impact, however, was on the broader media landscape. Viewers and commentators began questioning the preparation and transparency of other political interviewers. Morgan's approach, ambushing guests with selective statistics and constant interruptions, was suddenly under scrutiny. Other hosts found themselves being asked about their show's funding and potential conflicts of interest. A week after the interview, a media analysis firm published data showing that Morgan's viewership had dropped by 17%, while his social media engagement had shifted dramatically negative. Network executives were reportedly re-evaluating the direction and tone of the show. Meanwhile, Crockett's office released a comprehensive document containing all the sources and data she had cited during the interview, along with additional context that time hadn't permitted her to share on air. This 22-page document itself went viral in political circles, with journalism professors sharing it as a case study in how public figures can effectively combat misinformation. Perhaps most telling was the reaction from Crockett's constituents at a town hall the following weekend. Attendance was nearly double the usual number. When she was introduced, the crowd gave her a standing ovation before she had spoken a word. One elderly gentleman approached the microphone during the Q&A session and simply said, "I've never been prouder to be represented by you than when you stood your ground with that Morgan fellow." Political analysts began discussing the longer-term implications. What Crockett demonstrated, wrote one prominent columnist, wasn't just media savvy, it was a template for how to reclaim narrative control from bad faith interviewers. She didn't match Morgan's confrontational tone. She transcended it with preparation and precision. Behind the scenes, Morgan's production team was reportedly revamping their research process and instituting new disclosure policies for financial relationships. Network executives initially furious about the embarrassing moment eventually recognized that meaningful changes were needed to restore credibility. 3 weeks after the interview, a surprising development emerged. One of Morgan's longtime producers resigned and published a blog post, detailing how the show had systematically prepared different types of questions for guests based on their political affiliation. According to this insider account, progressive guests were routinely given hostile treatment, while conservative voices received softballs, all under the guise of balanced journalism. For Crockett, the incident became a defining moment in her political career, but she was careful not to let it overshadow her policy work. In her first major interview after the Morgan Showdown, she redirected most questions about the viral moment to focus instead on legislation she was championing. "What happened with Mr. Morgan isn't really about him or me," she explained. "It's about the responsibility we all have, politicians, media, and citizens, to engage with facts rather than convenient narratives. If that interview causes even one viewer to start checking sources or questioning statistics they hear on TV, then something good came from it." 6 months later, when Morgan's show was quietly reformed, and his role reduced, media observers pointed to the Crockett interview as the beginning of the end for his particular brand of confrontational journalism. One media critic wrote, "Morgan made his name by putting people on the spot." But when Congresswoman Crockett turned the tables, she exposed the fragility of his entire approach. The most lasting image from the encounter remained that screenshot of Morgan's shocked face, mouth slightly open, eyes widened, as he realized he had been outmaneuvered by a guest he had expected to dominate. It joined the pantheon of iconic media moments, where carefully constructed personas crumbled under the weight of reality. For politically engaged Americans, the Crockett-Morgan showdown became shorthand for preparation triumphing over bluster, for substance defeating style. In Washington circles, a new phrase entered the lexicon: pulling a Crockett, defined as thoroughly researching an opponent and calmly exposing their contradictions with irrefutable evidence. And for Jasmine Crockett herself, while she continued to focus on the legislative work that had brought her to Congress, she also recognized the value of that viral moment in amplifying her voice. Sometimes she told a group of young women at a leadership conference, "You have to be heard before you can be listened to." The story of how Jasmine Crockett shut down Piers Morgan became more than just another viral political moment. It became a case study in media literacy, preparation, and the changing dynamics of political communication in the digital age. If you enjoyed this breakdown of how Congresswoman Crockett masterfully handled Piers Morgan, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the most explosive political confrontations and detailed analysis every week. Hit that notification bell to never miss our latest uploads, and share this video with anyone who loves seeing powerful figures held accountable. Comment below with your thoughts on this showdown, and who you'd like to see featured in our next video.